Welcome back to How Would You Beat, where we discuss how you can use jobs to be done innovation methods to beat your competition. Remember to subscribe and like this podcast. In this episode, we will look at how you could beat Twitter. Twitter, of course, has been in the news because Elon Musk has entered an agreement to buy the company and possibly transform it into something else. Who really knows? It's kind of speculation right now. But what we want to ask is, regardless of what happens with Elon Musk and what people think of him as a personality and a character and an entrepreneur and a business person, what would you do to beat Twitter? What is Twitter's real function in the world? Why are people hiring Twitter? And how would you beat them? And this could be, obviously, Twitter could build its own products and improve them, as a lot of people are calling for. But if you took the perspective that Twitter was actually a competitor and you wanted to compete with them and create a different service, how would you go about doing it? And could Jobs to be Done give you insights in beating Twitter, even after Elon Musk buys the platform? Or it could be a way that Twitter itself could improve, even if it does eventually go private. So how would you beat Twitter? What is Twitter being hired for? What is a social media company? It's an interesting question. How would you answer that, Jared?
It is an interesting question. Like, what is the point of social media? And I think that's like the first thing everybody thinks about when they think about how would you beat Twitter. Well, you'd have to create a competing social media platform. And if you've heard us talk about any of these competitor threats or competitor opportunities before, you know that we would always say, don't look at what the product is. Think about what the underlying job is. So what are people hiring Twitter to do, and how could you do that better? And I think in Twitter's case, it's a lot of different customers getting a lot of different jobs done. And I think that, the thing that they market in their brand is what's happening. So the question would be then, okay, or people want to find out what's happening. It's kind of a general job for consumers. And my question with that is always, is that underserved, and how important is it? And are people willing to pay for that? What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to frame it. And I think you're right. Social media is a product. So, we always talk about the wake up in the morning test. Does anybody wake up in the morning and say, I need social media? Well, people use social media, but social media is the product. It's not the underlying customer need or problem, as we would call it today. It's not an underlying job to be done. Social media is the platform and the product. And I think you're right. If you just took it as what's happening, obviously consumers need to stay informed about a subject. And so, obviously there's a news component, just what's happening in the world and in my local community in real time. There's even local service providers who have Twitter accounts, whether it's the sheriff or the fire department. In California, when we were in fire season, of course, Twitter was actually a very, very good way to stay informed of what was happening in fires. You get almost, near real-time information if you followed, CAL FIRE and local fire authorities, which is extremely valuable to stay informed about events unfolding nearly in real time. But of course, social media platforms are not just used for that. They're used by investors to find out information about companies. And they're used by journalists, of course, to inform the public, to try and monetize audiences and drive traffic. It's used by musicians, actors, artists to stay in touch with their fans. It's used by politicians to influence votes, and companies to talk about customer support and get a pulse on what's happening, about people talking about their companies if they've got issues or problems. It's used by brands trying to create awareness. There's an enormous number of jobs that this platform has enabled. And I think one of the reasons Twitter has struggled to be a really successful business just in terms of revenue and profitability, it's obviously got a big market cap. I mean, Elon Musk has proposed $44 billion for the company. So it's, that's a very, very successful company. And it's got significant revenue from its advertising side, but it's never really come together as just a juggernaut of profitability the way you would expect with the number of users and engagement that it has. And I think that's probably because it is trying to be a platform that's getting all these jobs done, and it doesn't do a great job of any of them individually. And that, if you were to look at it as a competitor, you're right. I agree. You wouldn't say, oh, I need to create a social media platform, or even can we use blockchain to create a social graph? I mean, maybe the answer with that is okay. If you were to create this kind of identity online for people, it would still have to get jobs done. It would still have to help them stay informed about a subject, to learn about a subject, to connect with others, all the jobs. And when we say those jobs, those are very, very complex goals that people have. It's not just a vague, statement. You would have to really dissect that and figure out what are all the needs in the job, who's the segment that's really underserved, that is either willing to pay or willing to use it on a very frequent basis. And that also gets into the competing on the advertising side.
Yeah, and I think that talking about Twitter is not a successful business or not a juggernaut of revenue and profitability, I think is a good way to put it. I think the way it's been in the news is it's not realizing its potential, right? So it's widely known that shareholders are upset with how, they call it the most important media company in the world with the most influence on the world stage is worth what it is. They think it should be worth a whole lot more. And people will call it the town square, right? That's an analogy we've heard a lot in the past few weeks. We've got the town square and everybody's there, and that's where you find out what's going on. And it is... you need free speech in that town square. And then that raises a whole host of questions about how to moderate a social media platform. What is the right way to do it? And I think it moves the conversation away from the value conversation. So I think that the question has been posed that says, well, if we clean up the way people talk on Twitter, we take the toxicity out, automatically it will be more valuable to everybody. And I think that, it would be a nicer experience, but will that actually just drive more value inherently if we just get rid of that? My hypothesis would be, no, that is not the only thing. The key is how do you help people unlock value in their own lives in a way that they're trying to do? And I think that those examples that you brought up, Jay, are really salient examples, because they're people who, if they work hard enough, are getting a lot of value. So I have investor friends that are saying the information I get on Twitter, I can't get anywhere else. It happens fastest, and I can use it to get an edge to grow the return on my portfolio. That is incredibly valuable to people. But has Twitter ever built a feature to help investors do that faster and more accurately than they can today? And the answer is no. And the reason they haven't is because of the way they think about what they're doing, right? If they think of themselves as the town square, as they think about the only job is to find out what's happening for everybody, then they're not going to build these more specific features that unlock customer value that they could ultimately charge for and improve their revenue model, because they're not winning on advertising. They're not winning on brand awareness. There are other places that brands can go to have more successful advertising.
Yeah, and I think that the problem for Twitter, I think, is generally this platform problem. It's and a lot of this is driven by just generally the kind of venture world. It seems great to be a platform, and of course, the big companies in the world are platforms. I mean, Google's a platform. Apple, obviously, with iOS and macOS, they're huge platforms where you can get multiple jobs done, and that's certainly true. And of course, this is how Microsoft became one of the most valuable companies in the world. The PC was a platform that got enormous amounts of jobs done. The problem with social media as a platform is exactly what you're saying. It's kind of doing all these things in a partially interesting way, and it's got some benefits, clearly. Just reading the New York Times is not going to give that investor the edge that they want, or it's not going to help, consumers stay informed about subjects that also can be very hyper local, like is there a fire in your neighborhood? Having experienced that. So it's not really doing any of those as well as it could.
Right.
So Twitter itself could take this approach. They would have different teams focused around these customer jobs. So they would have a team that's focused around investors, journalists, creative people, politicians, consumers, all those. You would take those different jobs. And Clay Christensen wrote about this, of course. Organize your company around your customer's job, not around your product. Very, very few companies do that, of course, today, but they should. And I think the other problem is their customer is the advertiser. And the reason they're not as valuable as Facebook and Google, they don't have as many users as Facebook, but Facebook has done a better job, for all the criticisms you can level at Facebook. They have done a better job of helping advertisers acquire customers. And of course, Google is just done an extraordinary job of changing the advertising industry because you can track every dollar. We've gone from the famous advertising cliche that 50% of advertising works. You just don't know which 50%. That is entirely untrue with Google. You know exactly to the dollar how much you're going to spend to acquire a customer. And Twitter has not done a good job on that. So their revenue side of the equation, while they do have a lot of revenue, they have not created the customer value for advertisers. So should they be in that business? Should it move to a subscription service? And the answer is they should focus on the user's job and where there's opportunities to get those users to pay for the premium Twitter investor service, for example. They should do that because investors obviously have a willingness to pay for investor information. It's incredibly valuable to them.
Look how much they're paying for Bloomberg. That company's enormous and super profitable.
That's right. And in some cases, like with consumers and politicians, they might have a free ad-driven model. But still, on top of that, you have to make it so that they can, that on top of those markets, the advertisers can really acquire customers and track it better than they can, in other mediums. I think the key to competing with Twitter, if you were to use jobs to be done to compete with Twitter, is to break it apart into these different customers. And a good example of where companies have done this very successful is with Craigslist, right? Craigslist obviously, performed a role and made it free to become this big marketplace. And you could do things like find a room to rent in someone's house. You could buy and sell used cars. You could find people to date. And all of those markets, because the true market is not an online marketplace. The market is to find accommodations. The market is to buy and sell used cars. The market is to find someone to go on a date with. So those jobs have been broken out into really big companies. Of course, Airbnb, which we've talked about before, is a $100 billion company that really does a better job than Craigslist at helping you find accommodations. So that initially, why you'd say, well, if I'm gonna approach Craigslist as a competitor, I must be this generalizable marketplace as well. That's untrue.
Yes.
And the reason that's untrue is because you have to get the job done better. And we talk about these jobs like finding accommodations, but if people want to learn more about how complex jobs are, just that statement, find accommodations, has 16 different steps and 100 or so different needs. These are really, really complicated goals that customers are trying to achieve. So you can look at those and break them down. And that's exactly why Airbnb became such a successful company, because it took this one job and it said, we are going to focus on all the elements of that job and compete with someone who can do it for free on Craigslist. And that's true of Twitter. Each of these, the investor market, you're right. I mean, Twitter in a way is competing with Bloomberg. You wouldn't say that if you thought the market was social media. You would say Twitter is competing with Facebook, but it's not.
Right.
And for investors, it's competing with Bloomberg.
Right.
Yeah. So
and in every single one of these jobs we
this.
talked about, there are great competitors, right? So if you look at performers, actors, musicians, artists, authors, athletes who are trying to build and monetize a fan base, there are competitors there, right? There's Patreon, there's Substack, there's Gumroad, there are traditional sources like
SoundCloud,
movies, right?
Yeah.
Publicists help you do that. There are a lot of competitors, really large industries and large businesses, just in that one niche of Twitter. Instagram is making a lot of money out of this, and so I think that it's very interesting. When I started my career in tech, it was circa 2006, and at the time there was a sort of mantra out there, which was just like, get a lot of users and money will follow. And
Yep.
I think what happened then is you had companies like Twitter, like Tumblr, like Facebook, but Facebook kind of figured out their advertising play. But Twitter and Tumblr are great examples of companies that got a lot of users. Like Tumblr sold for $1 billion to Yahoo. And they just said like, well, we'll throw advertising on at some point, and then that's where the money will come from. But they didn't have a clear view of what customer value they were delivering to whom. They kind of ran like a media business as opposed to a functional software application. And as a result of that, you end up doing a lot of jobs sort of well for a lot of people, but not nailing any of them. Because the idea was, how do we get people to visit more, not let's be very focused about the value we're delivering and make sure we're delivering that and figuring out what people are willing to pay for. And so now you've got these media companies like Twitter with a bunch of pockets of potential giant value, but they think that they're supposed to serve everybody. And so it's hard to change the company culture to focus on one of those segments. Now, to Twitter's credit, they have started some bets in some more narrower markets. So they are building products for what they call creators, right? What I just called performers, or you can break it down more specifically to actors, musicians, authors. They're creating some products for creators to help them build and monetize a fan base. They have a tip jar where somebody who likes somebody's tweets on a regular basis can just give them some money. So it's kind of like Patreon, right? They're kind of copying Patreon, really. And then they've got a newsletter product where you can, push out your Twitter content to a select group of people who pay for it. So that's essentially a Substack copy. They have this feature set coming up called Super Follows, where people can pay to be a different tier of a follower to you, and then they get specialized content that you create specifically for them, which is a lot like Medium premium content or a lot like Substack. And I think that's a good start, right? This is along the lines of what we're talking about. Like, pick a customer base that's trying to get a job done. They're trying to build and monetize a fan base. Where I would take it, if I wanted to be better than those products, is to go more specific. So what if we just chose actors? What would they have that's different if they want to build and monetize a fan base than somebody who's writing a newsletter, than an author would? How would you approach that?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's exactly how you would approach it. And I would say that if Twitter wanted to do this, of course, the most important thing for Twitter would be how they organize their company and their teams and what process are they using to innovate. And we've said this, a lot of times. People often love to try and copy Apple's products. They rarely copy Apple's process. And Apple's process, we know, Phil Schiller said this, that the grand unified theory of Apple is asking, what job is the watch being hired to do? What job is the iPhone being hired to do? And they think about their customers using the product to get jobs done. And, we should put a link to this, but the iPad 2 ad, "We're Always," is one of the greatest ads of all time, because when they launched that, they talked about how, you're always going to root for your favorite team. You're always going to cook a good meal. You're always going to get lost in a good book. You're always going to make home movies, but how you do it is never going to be the same. And basically, it was a list of jobs to be done, and they were showing that they had a platform to get each one of those done, faster and more accurately, as we always say. And so you can see Apple internally has this focus on the customer. Even Steve Jobs said this. He said, you have to focus on the customer experience and then work backwards to the product. You can't start with the product idea. And so here, where you've got, if Twitter's culture is like, we're a social media company, what can we do with social media companies to keep users more engaged with social media? That's a mistake. But what they could do is organize around these customers and say, okay, what are we doing for investors? What are we doing for journalists? What are we doing for performers? Like, let's say this creative one is a great example. Today's world in music, for example, is not the old world of record companies, funding a lot of money to get your record recorded. Then they've got to fund a lot of inventory through their distribution to put CDs into stores. Everything is streaming. So if you are a musician today, to generate revenue from a fan base, that is a job to acquire customers, essentially, as a musician. Doing it through social media is an amazing way to do it. So if Twitter had a team that was just entirely focused on how musicians generate more fans to generate more streams to get more subscription revenue, et cetera, that would be a huge opportunity, by the way, because the music industry finally, after a couple decades, is now back up to its peak in 1999. So the music industry is growing a lot, and there are a lot more musicians because you can make a living as a musician. You don't have to have these huge record companies financing and all that. So that's a great opportunity where they could just say, okay, how are we helping musicians acquire fans, acquire paying fans, revenue generating fans. And that alone, that's so big and complex that this is how jobs to be done can be very helpful. You need to break that job down. That is a very, very complex job with hundreds of needs, and you need to figure out where musicians are underserved and what your product can do. And just being a social media network is not enough to really capitalize on that opportunity.
Totally.
It's just one.
Yeah, you made me think of something, which is that a lot of times in business, you're taught to think big, right? You present an idea and somebody says, think bigger. And you end up saying, let's target everyone and have them do everything, right? And it almost takes courage to say, let's target a smaller group of people and go all the way for them. And I think that courage to go all the way can unlock value. So rather than saying, let's help all different types of creators improve their audience and monetization a little bit, why not say, let's help musicians, for example, who are trying to build their fan base and increase their revenue deeply and do the whole thing for them and really knock it out of the park. And I think that it kind of takes a little bit of courage to go narrow, and it's hard to do.
Well, it takes courage to want to build a repeatable process. This is what I think, we live in a world where the past few decades have just seen this unbelievably huge wave of things moving online and being converted to software. So we are in this incredible age of extraordinary growth because software plus the internet really does get jobs done, way better than other solutions. And that's because what humans need to accomplish, the goals they need to accomplish in their lives, now known as jobs to be done, take information inputs and decision making and getting to outputs to achieve the goal, just broadly. Whether you're trying to get a baby to sleep tonight, get to a destination on time, maintain an aircraft, or restore artery blood flow, it doesn't matter. All those goals take information inputs and decision making outputs. And that's the basis of the theory. And that's what software and the internet are just extraordinarily good at doing. And what's happened in a lot of cases, Twitter is a great example of this. Just being in that world where people are just massively moving online, you can occasionally win the lottery. And Twitter, of course, famously was, okay, let's make kind of an open text system where instead of being these private, chat messaging, people could, publicly do it. And
yeah, it actually started as a podcasting company.
Yeah, right. And then, that's so ironic. So, but then what happened was that was interesting, of course, because then you could also follow people. So you could see the text of whatever star you were interested in, or famous person or intriguing person, and you could follow their essentially what previously would have been private text. So they grew incredibly fast. Once they figured out some basic metrics about how many people you need to follow and all that. And that's great, but that's really a kind of wave phenomenon. The next phase is really focusing on the jobs, the goals, the people who are using that platform to become something that's incredibly valuable. And it's exactly analogous to Craigslist. So, of course, Craigslist was doing a better job than classified ads, right? I mean, remember I'm definitely old enough, you had to open the newspaper, go to the back with these tiny prints and, try and find an apartment to rent, and you would circle them. And then, it was crazy. It's much better to just type it into a web browser.
High school to try to find a summer job. My parents were like, get the pencil out and circle things.
Yeah. I lived in New York one summer, so we go to the Village Voice, and then you got to go. Right. It was all, you didn't get to see pictures of it, anything. But I think about Airbnb now; it's just a beautiful experience. You just like, oh, that looks like a wonderful house to rent in Italy, whatever. So these opportunities are really, really big underneath social media, but you have to get out of the mode of thinking like, oh, to compete with Twitter, you'd have to create a competitive social media company. That would just lead you to the Microsoft Zune mistake, which is, likely not going to end well. So there are really meaningful opportunities to help people with these jobs, which, whether you're a musician, a brand, a consumer, a politician, a journalist, investor, they're just enormous markets. But you have to remember the market, you have to define it from the customer's perspective and their goal, and break it down. And then even, as Jared, you're saying, starting smaller, even with within the investor market, you could segment that market, or even within the musician market, you could segment that market, and you'd want to find that segment that really is pounding their head against the table, struggling to get the job done, and more likely to adopt and buy your solution. And then, of course, I know we talked about it on the advertising side. If they wanted to continue an advertising model, they really have to figure out how to help advertisers acquire customers faster, more accurately, and cheaper. It can't just be, brand advertising is part of the advertising market, obviously, just awareness. But companies are smart. They will stop spending on just brand awareness if their revenue doesn't grow, right?
Or if it's not helping them increase awareness.
Exactly.
And I'd be remiss to not raise an interesting idea from Ben Thompson at Stratechery. Love his blog, by the way, stratechery.com. And it's related to this: how do you organize the company? And if you have all these competitors going after more specific jobs, and it's difficult to organize Twitter around that, how might you organize it to take advantage of the platform aspects of Twitter? And he had this interesting notion, which is you could, and I think I've heard this elsewhere too. I'm not sure he's the first person to say it, but he articulated it extremely well. The idea being that you could take the platform part of Twitter, the API essentially, and turn that into a B2B service where you provide the information that's flowing around on Twitter and the social graph to other companies. You license that to them and make them pay a fee for it. And the current Twitter experience that everybody consumes today, all the users consume today, the mobile app and the website where you have the feed and all the different features, and it's an advertising model, that would be one of the companies that licenses the API from the Twitter service company. And so he calls it Twitter Service Co. and Twitter App Co. And Twitter App Co. would have the same sort of privileges on the API as every other company that buys into it does. And so what happens there is for the platform gets a different customer. It gets other businesses. It becomes a B2B. And they have to think through how, what is that job that those businesses are trying to get done? And they would have to design the platform to help serve that very well. And then the Twitter app, the client that we're used to using today with that experience, would essentially be competing with all of these other applications that might try to get more specific jobs done and might have different moderation policies. And the market would say, what is the best thing for each job? And Twitter would make money in all scenarios. So rather than losing to a competitor that takes a more narrow approach and gets a specific job done all the way and generates revenue out of that, they win on that too because they get paid for the platform usage.
Yeah, and that is essentially the technical solution to targeting different jobs and different customers using the Twitter API. And one thing that's interesting about that is there are different approaches. The business model of that could be Twitter does that internally and creates these different groups, and they say, okay, you all have access to the Twitter API. And this group is targeting politicians. This group is targeting journalists. This group is targeting artists. This group is targeting, consumers, et cetera, and have them compete. And you could also, if you did open up that API, you would create a competitive marketplace where hopefully entrepreneurs would come up with ideas that would take advantage of the API and then do a much better job. It's almost like if Craigslist had that kind of API and then Airbnb utilized it. Actually, they did kind of famously do that. They hacked Craigslist postings. I can't remember the exact details of it, but they helped move people into Airbnb, and then but then eventually Craigslist lost out, and Airbnb obviously became much more successful in that market. But that could be a way that Twitter could then eventually acquire those companies. They could say, okay, we're looking at this, and these people, this company here is doing a great job with politicians, and that's growing with the Twitter API, and then they acquire that, or they could fund it internally. And when we talk to companies, a company itself is essentially a venture capital firm, because what it's doing is it's allocating its capital to different projects that are hopefully going to generate more growth. And sometimes you just have such a good product that it generates almost all your revenue and profitability. And that's exactly what happened with Google, right? Google just happens to have a product in search and AdWords that is worth $3 trillion. Now, Google's venture capital function of allocating capital to new products has been absolutely terrible. We've emphasized before, the Google graveyard is very large. And that's true of most venture investing. Most of it fails to even return the capital. So, but this is a way that companies should think about allocating those resources, whether you create a corporate venture arm or whether you just create different groups to start targeting these customers in this way. It's a way of mitigating the risk that investment in building something for investors or journalists or artists or politicians or brands or whoever doesn't help get their job done.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that we talked about the Apple and their processes a lot. There's a model that could be adopted here too. When you think about what does the App Store help with? What job is that being hired to do? Well, developers are trying to grow a successful business, essentially, a successful application. And the App Store, provides developer tools to make it a little bit easier to build your app, but it also provides distribution for your application. It's a lot easier to get distributed to a lot of different phones if you go through the App Store than try to build something that people install on their own. The thing that the Apple does not provide through the App Store is data for your application. And that is something the Twitter Service API, in Ben Thompson's world, Twitter Service Co., could help get that job done that is currently very underserved, right? If you're a startup trying to build an application and you want to use machine learning and you want to train for a very specific problem, you don't have the data to do it. You're getting dominated by these big companies. And Twitter has a lot of data, which people could do a lot of interesting things with. So there's an unmet need in the developer market who are trying to build new successful businesses to get the data they need to populate their platforms and make them more successful and satisfy needs for their users. So you can see how jobs to be done applies to each customer that you might target. You can think about how are your competitors leaving opportunities on the table to get the jobs done better.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it's like how would Twitter compete with Apple too, which is an interesting question. And what I would say, what's interesting about Apple is Apple also does not release a product until it's good enough. We've talked about this before, but Steve Jobs famously said he was as proud of the things they said no to as he was about the things they said yes to. And I think that's incredibly important for Twitter. And any company wants to compete is really you need to understand the customer's job completely. Jobs are very, very complex. They have a lot of steps. They have a lot of needs, and let's just take musicians trying to profitably acquire fans, right? Generate revenue from fans, however you want to define the job. That job is very, very, very complex, and it has a lot of steps, hundreds of needs, et cetera. And what they've done now is kind of, okay, we have a tip jar, right? That's not really helping to get the whole job done. That's one element of it. And sure, there might be some people who tip, but if you're really going to compete and you're really going to create essentially like a multi-billion-dollar opportunity out of serving musicians, which there is clearly an opportunity there. I mean, music it's enormous business. It's growing. It's going to be around forever. People are going to make music. People are going to buy and pay for music in various different ways and business models. It's a huge market on its own. If they wanted to really do that well, it would be way more than a tip jar, right? Yeah. Apple wouldn't launch just here's a tip jar, throw in for an artist. They would wait and figure out, well, okay, how is this going to be different? I mean, Apple hasn't been 100% successful with everything, obviously, but they have an enormously high success rate. And I think this is because they take this mentality that like, if we're going to do this and we're going to help get the job done better, we really have to do it better. And jobs are very, very complex. What customers are hiring a product to do is not just a simple 1-word, 3-word, 4-word statement like, oh yeah, let's just help musicians, acquire fans with a tip jar. That's not a good enough approach. You have to understand the needs. You have to segment. You have to size the segment. You really have to understand the willingness to pay. Yep. You have to measure speed and accuracy against the current products and the current competitions. This is what product teams are responsible for doing, and it is a lot of work. It is not a simple thing. But if you, as leadership at Twitter or leadership of any company is going to compete, you've got to set your team up for success by focusing them on the right goal, and that's really the process implementation part of it. That I think, if you wanted to compete with Twitter, that's how you would do it.
That's great. It's probably a good place to wrap up there on that note about how to compete with Twitter. And how Twitter can unlock value for
Interesting discussion. And, if people want to continue the discussion, feel free to reach out to us. Thanks for listening. Remember to subscribe and like to the podcast. If you want to learn more about Jobs to be Done innovation methods, visit us at thrv.com.